Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Nightmare on Elm Street series with A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, which I have both on VHS and on DVD. Now, the DVD here came on the Nightmare on Elm Street box set, which you can see right behind me. Now, The Dream Child came out in 1989, and this is obviously the fifth film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and it also acts as the third of what fans consider to be the Dream Trilogy, the other two films in this trilogy being A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Now, I already reviewed this movie along with all the other Nightmare on Elm Street films all the way back in 2011 for Season 1 of Horror Month. Those reviews are still up, however they're no longer public, but you can still see them on the Horror Month Season 1 playlist, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. I also discussed this movie at length in a 2018 retrospective on the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise I recorded with some friends of mine, which I'll also leave a link to in the description below. However, I will also include some audio from that retrospective later on in this video. And I also recently re-reviewed the first 4 Nightmare on Elm Street movies, which you could check out on the playlist for Horror Month Season 12. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 was a huge financial success and was the highest grossing film in the franchise up until that point, so of course New Line immediately rushed the sequel into production. Now, I don't know how true this is. I read this on IMDb, so take this with a grain of salt. I know IMDb is not always the most reliable source of information, but apparently before we got the movie that we did, New Line actually approached people like Frank Miller and even Stephen King to write and direct this movie. Would have been really fascinating to see how Frank Miller would have done a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, and it also would have been interesting to see how Stephen King would have tackled this material. I mean, it is kind of Stephen King's version of A Nightmare on Elm Street if you really stop to think about it. And yes, I know he started writing that book before the first movie even came out, but the two stories are very similar. Well, the stories themselves aren't necessarily similar, but Freddy Krueger and Pennywise are very similar villains. Now, regardless of whether it was true or not that New Line approached those people to do this movie, it obviously didn't happen. I know David Scow, who is a big name in the horror genre, wrote a script called Freddy Rules, which actually sounded pretty interesting. It was going to have something to do with something known as the Coma Pit, which is apparently the only part of the dream world that Freddy is afraid to go, but that script was never made. Now, the screenplay for the film that we ended up getting was written by Leslie Bohem, who would go on to write movies like Dante's Peak and The Darkest Hour, and he also created the Steven Spielberg-produced miniseries Taken. And Bohem's script was based on an earlier script by John Skipp and Craig Spector, who are both authors and are big names in the splatterpunk genre. Splatterpunk is a literary subgenre of horror that was really popularized by people like Clive Barker. Like, New Line really wanted people who worked in the splatterpunk genre to work on this movie. Now, the film was directed by Stephen Hopkins, who prior to this worked as a second unit director on Highlander, and he also directed a 1987 slasher film called Dangerous Game, but he would go on to direct movies like Predator 2, Judgment Night, Lost in Space, The Ghost in the Darkness, Race, and The Reapin'. He also directed episodes of Tales from the Crypt, 24, and Californication, and he also directed the pilot for that Dark Tower series that Amazon was going to do that unfortunately never got picked up. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 was considered to be kind of a disappointment when it first came out. It was not a flop by any means. It actually did do well, but it was not the hit that New Line was hoping for, especially not coming off the heels of 4. But fans were disappointed, and critics, of course, savaged the film, and to this day, this is still considered to be one of the weaker Nightmare on Elm Street movies. But you know what? I really like A Nightmare on Elm Street 5. I do not think this movie is anywhere near as bad as people make it out to be, and I actually don't understand why this movie gets so much hate. Is the movie perfect? No. Are there moments in the film where the acting is questionable? Certainly. And is the movie at times tonally inconsistent? Absolutely. But I still really appreciate some of the things that this movie tries to do. Now, Robert Shaye, who is the producer for these movies, said that he really wanted to return the series to its darker roots. And New Line really wanted this film to have the same dark tone as the first movie, which it doesn't completely succeed at, but I still really appreciate that they tried, especially after Part 4 was more of a horror comedy. But that does lead to some of the problems of the film, the fact that Freddy in this movie is still very much the comedic Freddy that we got in Part 4, yet the movie around him is so ungodly dark and touches on a lot of really dark themes, and it comes off very tonally inconsistent. Like, the rest of the actors are almost treating this like serious drama, whereas you have Robert Englund still doing the zany one-liners and making the lame puns whenever he would kill people. Like, it's almost as if you took the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz and dropped her in Robert Eggers' The Witch. That being said, there actually are some moments in the movie where I do find Freddy to be pretty creepy, which is more than I can say for Part 4, even though I do think 4 was overall a better film. I also liked how this one really does expand upon the mythology that was established in Dream Warriors. Now, in Dream Warriors, we were introduced to this nun named Sister Mary Helena, who was revealed at the end of that movie to be a ghost, and she was actually the ghost of Amanda Krueger, who was Freddy's mother. In Dream Warriors, it was revealed that Amanda Krueger was a nun who was part of a religious order that ran the Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital in the 1940s, and she was accidentally locked in a certain wing of the hospital for the worst of the criminally insane, and the inmates kept her hidden, and she was repeatedly raped by these people, and when they found her, she was pregnant, and that child grew up to be Freddy Krueger. And we get a lot more of that backstory in this movie. First of all, sorry about the dramatic change in lighting. It was getting darker outside, so I needed to turn the light on. So, the plot of A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 is we follow the character of Alice Johnson, who is the main character of the previous film, who ended up destroying Freddy at the end of that movie, and she has now graduated high school with her boyfriend Dan, and it seems like they'll now be able to live relatively normal lives. But Freddy uses the spirit of his mother Amanda to bring himself back from hell, and eventually we learn that Alice is pregnant, and Alice starts seeing this little boy in her dreams who calls himself Jacob, and eventually we learn that this little boy is in fact her unborn child. And it turns out that Freddy is living through Jacob's dreams, and he is also feeding Jacob the souls of his victims so he can turn him into a dream demon like he is. So now Alice, with the help of Amanda Krueger, has to find a way to save Jacob's soul. Now in the film, Lisa Wilcox reprises the role of Alice, and she's good in the movie, although it might disappoint people that she was such a badass in the previous film, and here we see her in a much more vulnerable state because she's pregnant throughout most of the movie. And we also don't really get to see her use her powers as the Dream Master, which I would be fine with if she maybe got another movie, but this was the last film in the franchise where this character showed up. She did later show up in some of the Nightmare on Elm Street comics, but whether you count those as canon is highly debatable. I also don't think Alice was as well written in this movie as she could have been, because there are moments in the film where she really doesn't do herself any favors by talking about Freddy around people who would have no idea what she's talking about. Like, if you start going off about how the ghost of a dead serial killer is coming for your unborn baby, people are obviously gonna think you're nuts. But she does have some pretty powerful moments in this, like when she stands up to Dan's parents when they want to take her baby from her because they don't think she's mentally competent enough to take care of a child. You also have Danny Hassel reprising his role as Dan from the previous film, and he's not in the movie much, but I've always liked the character of Dan. Now, something that some people could take as a continuity error is the fact that we see Alice and Dan have a whole group of friends that we did not see in the previous film. But granted, Dan was a popular guy, so it's possible that these could have been people that Dan was already friends with, that he introduced Alice to in the events between between this and the previous film. In the movie, you have Joe Seeley as the character of Mark. Now, Mark is actually one of my favorite characters in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but the actor playing him, I hate to say it, is not very good in the movie. It's like one of those deals where you like the character, but the actor playing him is not very good. And I'm not trying to be mean. On the off chance that the actor is watching this video, I'm not saying that to be, like, personally insulting to the guy. Again, like, it's not that he was terrible in the movie, but some of his line deliveries were a little cheesy. At the same time, the character of Mark, I've always kind of related to this guy. And you have Erika Anderson, who people might recognize from Twin Peaks as the character of Greta. And Greta is actually a very sad and tragic character. Like, it's implied that there's some abuse going on between her and her mother all her life has been pressuring her to be a model, and it's also implied that she has some eating disorders. And that actually makes her death in the movie, spoiler, all the more disturbing. You also have Kelly Jo Minter as Yvonne, and I know a lot of people don't like this character, but I've always liked Yvonne. I've never really had a problem with her. And Nicholas Mele reprises his role as Alice's father from the previous film, and I actually really liked him in this movie. And he was a prick in the previous film, but here you see him actually trying to keep his alcoholism in check, and you see him try to be a better father to Alice, and I thought that was really cool how you saw this character, who is a minor character in both these movies, go through kind of an arc between the two films. And there's this really sad and touching moment in the film. It's shortly after they find out Alice is pregnant. He says, "I hope it's a boy. It would be nice to have a boy running around the house again," which is obviously a reference to Rick, who was killed in the previous film. That's an attention not just to continuity, but to characterization that these Nightmare on Elm Street sequels really do not get enough credit for. You also have Whit Hartford as the dream version of Jacob. And you have Beatrice Boepple, I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, as the ghost of Amanda Krueger. Now, this character was played by Nan Martin in Dream Warriors, but in Dream Warriors, the character took on the form of an old woman, whereas here we see her take on the form of a young woman. And Amanda Krueger is actually a really tragic character when you stop to think about it. Not only is she a rape victim, but in this afterlife, she's basically condemned to this eternal battle with her demonic son. Almost as if God is punishing her for birthing this monster, even though it's not her fault at all. So yeah, I know it's a deeply flawed film, but I like A Nightmare on Elm Street 5. I actually like this movie a lot. And I love the set design in the movie. The whole film has this, like, gothic feel. And the whole movie has this real dark and kind of creepy tone to it. I will say that I always found the Freddy baby to be pretty freaking creepy, and it scared the shit out of me when I was a little kid. But I want to point out, I know everybody went crazy over Baby Yoda, and there were all these memes based on Baby Yoda. There needs to be memes based on Freddy Baby. Freddy Baby needs to be merchandised. Seriously, I want Baby Freddy to be the next big thing. Make it happen, internet. And there actually is a lot of drama in the film that, in my opinion, really improves the story. And it touches on a lot of really heavy and heady themes for a slasher movie sequel. It talks about teen pregnancy and even abortion at one point. And those are themes that you wouldn't think a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel would touch on. Again, it's not a perfect movie. There are some silly things that happen in the film, and you do have characters doing really stupid things, which is almost expected for an 80s slasher film, but I do think this movie is a lot better than its reputation would lead you to believe. Now, I want to point out the soundtrack for this movie. During the end credits, they play the song Let's Go by Kool Moe Dee, which is actually a good song. The only thing is, it has nothing to do with the movie, and it doesn't fit the tone of the movie at all, which is kind of hilarious, actually. And ever since I was a young kid and I saw this movie for the first time, the song just always stood out to me. The fact that you had this relatively dark film up until that point, and then they play this cheesy rap song at the end. Now, like I said earlier, this film is still maligned by a lot of fans of the franchise, but it does seem to have made a small impact on pop culture. There was a 2015 EP by Nicole Dollanganger called Greta Gibson Forever. Greta Gibson is the full name of the character of Greta from this movie, and the album cover actually is a drawing of that character. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to the segment of the Nightmare on Elm Street retrospective that I did with my friends back in 2018, where we discussed this movie. Keep in mind, some of the same points that I brought up in this part of the video, I also bring up again in that part of the video, and there will be some spoilers in our discussion. Now we come to A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. This is one that's really hated by a lot of fans. I actually kind of like this one. I like how it really continues the story from 4. They bring back Alice, they bring back Dan, and they bring back Alice's father. And I feel like this one tried to be a little bit darker than the last one. There's definitely the whole, like, gothic theme to the film, or gothic tone to the film, I should say. But it also has a lot of Freddy's stupid one-liners, though, which almost don't really work, considering that they're trying to go in more of a darker direction, but I still really enjoy the film, but what do you guys think of Part 5?
Well, I have kind of a similar take on Part 5 as I did on Part 4. I think there are some sequences that work. Overall, I just think it's sort of, it doesn't really come together as a coherent whole for me. Also, the kid who plays Jacob, the kid, he's just like a creepy looking kid. He's got like those sunken eyes and everything like that. He's like, I don't know, that bothered me when I saw it.
I do want to point out that actor who plays Jacob in the movie, I believe he was also the kid in Jurassic Park who tells Sam Neill that the raptor doesn't look that scary, and then Sam Neill, like, scares the shit out of him with the raptor claw.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, I think that kid also was on like different TV shows and stuff like that. He was like around at that time on different things.
That kid's creepiness kind of worked for me. It kind of added to this really creepy tone that the film has, because the film does have kind of a creepy tone to it, which once again, I feel like Freddy being very comedic in the film almost doesn't work, considering how gothic a lot of the rest of the film is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some good creepy scenes in this movie, but overall, it's just, a lot of it is just so silly. And, I mean, you know, you have...
Are you trying to tell me that Mark's death scene, where he gets turned into a comic book and chopped up, is not one of the greatest horror scenes in horror movie history?
You know, I liked the character of Mark. And his
I loved Mark in the movie.
And his dream was really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the part where he does get turned into paper and then he just goes, no! It's like, oh, that's...
Yeah, I mean, one scene that, as a little kid, when I first saw this movie, really creeped me out was Greta's death scene.
Yeah, that scared me.
And especially, like, I have the VHS for this movie, and they have, like, the scene where she's in the refrigerator and, like, her cheeks are all filled with
begging
food and
Alice
shit.
for help.
But, but like the character's so cliched, like, you know, it's like such a cliche. Like the mother wants her to be a model. It's just like so. It's like and she's like upper class and everything. I thought it was just so cliche.
Yeah, the mother, you could tell, was just like this kind of snobby wasp.
Oh, the mother, the mother was a cartoon character.
Yeah,
the mother was an absolute cartoon.
Face, the robotic way she moves. Don't chew with your mouth full, dear.
Yeah,
you know?
Greta, that's not what a cover girl puts in her body. But
terrible.
You know what though? I still liked the characters, though, with the exception of Greta's mother, of course. But I of course like Alice.
Yeah.
Even though there were points in this movie where I don't think she was very well written in the film, because there were points in this movie where she really wasn't doing herself any favors by talking about Freddy around people who would have no idea what she's talking about. But I liked how they brought back Dan and they killed him off like that.
They killed him off so
I want to point out Dan's death scene in the movie is very H.R. Giger inspired, the way he turns into he becomes part machine. I like Greta in the movie. I mean, I like the characters, but I could see why people might find them to be cliched, though.
I mean, I like the character of Mark because I'm also a comic book fan, but, the character I couldn't really stand in the movie for most of it was Yvonne, who was just so annoying.
You see, I never minded Yvonne. I never minded her at all.
I mean, I get it. She's trying to be the professional, especially since she works at a hospital, but it's before Mark died, it's like 2 of your friends have suffered mysterious deaths.
And you still don't believe it, yeah.
Even Mark, the one who was at that point still alive, he has these mysterious cuts on his hands. Don't you think you should at least try to discuss this a little instead of just blowing it off?
What do you guys think of them bringing Amanda Krueger back in this one?
I think it's effective, although, in the third one, she's presented as an old woman. Here, she's presented as younger, which I think they're trying to show different forms of her throughout her life.
Well, she's a ghost. She doesn't have a physical body. So
I actually thought that was some of the most effective sequences with her.
Yeah.
With her. So I actually thought those were some of the better scenes.
Hang on. Although I have to say, it's said that, she hung herself after Freddy's trial and that her body was never found. But it's like, well, then how'd they know that she hung herself?
Yeah, good point, yeah.
Holy shit, you're right. I never even thought about that. It's yeah. Yeah, it's not a great movie, but I guess because I have a lot of nostalgia for it, I give this movie more of a pass than maybe I should. But I do think it's a little more well-made than it's given credit for, especially considering I know they really rushed Stephen Hopkins with the film.
Yeah, he only had 4 weeks to shoot the movie. And, I think, it is... There are a lot of interesting, creative death scenes, and they're pulled off, special effects-wise. Although Dan's death... it's horrific, because of what's happening to his body, but at the same time, the dialogue is just so over the top.
This boy feels the need for speed.
Don't dream and drive.
Well, I feel like the need for speed thing kind of worked because, you knew that Dan's father was really putting a lot of pressure on him, and Dan's father said that to him at one point. So it's okay, that was Freddy really, tapping into the fact that Dan did not have a great relationship with his father. That sort of worked, even though it was really cheesy, the fact that he's on a motorcycle and Freddy says that.
Yeah, and also before that, when he's still in the car, he hears his own mother over the radio calling him I forget what she calls him.
My wayward son Daniel, who's been seduced by that bimbo slut whore Alice. If I were you, lady, I'll kill the ungrateful.
Yeah, that's funny, but it's not... and then Freddy appears next to him and tears off his own arm. And
better buckle up.
Yeah, it's hilarious, which... Yeah, it's too over the top.
Yeah, it's that's the thing about this movie is, you have Freddy being very jokey, but a lot of the movie is trying to be very serious, so there's it's very tonally off, I think.
When Mark is in his dream, before the whole comic book stuff in the dream starts, he sees Greta in his dream begging him for help, and she's got the wound in her stomach, and that's creepy, I think. That's one of the film's good creepy moments, but... I wish there had been a lot more moments like that.
That's what I think really happened with the later sequels. They didn't know what they wanted to be. They were trying to please too many people. They were trying to be, please these, this demographic, or please this, you know what I mean? And when you do that with art, when you try to please so many people, it always comes out bland. It always comes out sort of, seeming forced or very sort of cliched.
I really wish they hadn't killed the character Mark, because unlike Yvonne, he was actually trying to help. He did all the research. He tried to stay awake and watch Alice. He failed at that, but he did try. It's like Yvonne was just, kept fighting them.
I am somewhat disappointed, though, that they never brought Alice back for any of the other sequels. I heard she was originally going to come back for Freddy's Dead, but they decided not to bring her back. And apparently in one of the earlier drafts for Freddy vs. Jason, she was actually going to come back in that, but that, of course, never happened.
Yeah, originally... they were going to make Alice's son Jacob the main character of Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, but then that script got tossed away because Rachel Talalay didn't like it, and she said that the new script saved the day, which I don't think it did.
Here is Mark Allen Gunnell's review of A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child.
Part 5, The Dream Child. I like that one a little better. The whole pregnancy subplot I thought was interesting and added a dimension to it that the others didn't have. I love the opening dream sequence where Alice becomes Freddy's mother in the asylum. I thought that was all great. The character work was still a little iffy for me. I didn't feel like they were fully realized. But it was a little darker. Freddy was still just, pumping out the jokes, but the look of the film and the atmosphere was a little darker. So it's not one of my favorites, but I do like it better than 4.
Here is Chris's review of Nightmare 5.
Now, I get why this one gets a lot of flack, but I really like it for the imagery. It's very gothic and it's very, heightened. There's a lot of really great scenes visually in it. Especially, I think there's one where, it's sort of almost like a church environment, and Freddy is, standing in front of this huge painted glass window, and he just kind of, slowly puts the fedora on. It's a really sick moment. And then the other one, I think, was towards the end when Freddy's claw, bursts out of the nun, and she's just, wrangling with it, as the doors close. That is a really sick moment and a really cool stamp on the franchise at that point. So yeah, admittedly, the story is kind of the idea of this baby kind of being the impetus for the whole thing. That's an interesting concept, but overall, I really like this one just honestly for the way it looks and the way it feels. Beyond that, it doesn't have a lot going for it, so I see why people find it empty, but I enjoy it personally. It's cool to watch.
And here are John's thoughts on the 5th Nightmare on Elm Street movie.
I thought the plot of Lisa Wilcox's character, where Freddy's trying to be reborn with her baby, is interesting, and the character who was a big comic book fan was my favorite. He kind of reminded me in some ways because I'm a huge diehard comic book fan myself, and I thought when Freddy kills him in comic book style, it was probably one of my favorite kills of the Nightmare series. My least favorite character of the series was
Yvonne, I think is her name.
Yvonne. She was so annoying that you felt that she was going to die in the film, but surprisingly she doesn't. I guess maybe they just thought, hey, let's have her survive in the series.
So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall. That was my review of A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, and my next movie review will be on Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare.